Welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. I'm your host, Yaakov. Since the beginning of the war, one of the issues that has really gotten under my skin is the way the media has simply accepted, hook, line, and sinker, the casualty toll as announced by Hamas. Under the name the Gaza Health Ministry, Hamas would announce the number of dead almost daily in the first few months of the war, and these numbers would simply be repeated verbatim by all media, from the BBC and CNN to the Washington Post and the Guardian and many more. This continued even after they were caught lying. Take the Al-Ali hospital incident in the beginning of the war. At the time, Hamas claimed that an Israeli missile strike killed 500 people after a hospital was bombed. Within hours, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, proved that they did not bomb the hospital, that it was a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket, and in fact, that the rocket had landed in the parking lot. Nothing had hit the hospital. Did that change the way the international media has reported on the death toll from this war? You already know the answer. On today's episode, we dive into the Gaza casualty toll. There's no question that many people have been killed in this war. It's tragedy on both sides. The latest estimates put the number just over 40,000 people. But the question is, who are they? Are they Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters, or are they civilians? Are they mostly children and women, as Hamas claims, or are they mostly men of fighting age? And if the numbers are like the Israeli Defense Forces claims, that about half are combatants, in other words, terrorists, and the other half are civilians, then you have a ratio of combatant to civilian ratio of 1-to-1 or 1-to-1.5, which is unprecedented in modern asymmetric urban warfare. Our guest today is Major Andrew Fox. Andrew served in the British Army from 2005 to 2021. He completed 3 tours in Afghanistan, including one attached to the U.S. Special Forces. He served in the Parachute Regiment and the Special Forces Support Group, with additional tours in Bosnia, the Middle East, and Northern Ireland. His extensive combat experience has established him as a recognized authority on all matters defense. And Andrew visited Gaza actually twice over the last year, embedded with the IDF. A few weeks ago, with the Henry Jackson Society, where he's a fellow, he published a study called Questionable Counting, analyzing the death toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza. The report raises lots of questions and casts doubt on the veracity of what has been reported until now. Andrew and his co-authors identified distortion of statistics, misreporting of natural deaths, deaths from before the war started that were included in the death toll from the war, and much, much more. You'll want to have a listen. So, Andrew, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. And we're here to talk about your recent report that came out with the Henry Jackson Society titled Questionable Counting, Analyzing the Death Toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza. I mean, there's a lot of elements of this that I want to break down, but because it's also been, I've not done an extensive report like you have, and that's why I enjoyed reading it so much, but it's like from day one of this conflict, one of the things that has just been driving me crazy is how people just parrot what they're told by the Gaza Health Ministry without recognizing the fact that it's Hamas. And you have this amazing chart, and I'm putting a link into the podcast notes here so people can actually look at the report itself. But before we even dive into the numbers, just this whole idea that 90-something% of world media is quoting Hamas, a terrorist organization, when they would never do this with Al-Qaeda, itself is just crazy to begin with.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know where they've managed to establish the credibility that they seem to have. It's quite astonishing, and I think if we dig into it, it's the product of decades of information operations. They also know how to play the West really cleverly. They know how to target our empathy, how to target the things that matter to us. And one of the big things, particularly in Western Europe, is doctors. And if somebody is a doctor, then they automatically have a huge amount of kudos and credibility. And so if they can get a doctor to say something, then that immediately carries weight. Never mind that the doctor in question might be that gentleman from the other week who was a colonel in Hamas. Or never mind that doctor may have been taken to Gaza by a deeply partisan NGO. You know, the fact that they have the words doctor in front of their name carries weight. And that's something they exploit endlessly.
100%. So put the media aside for a moment. Let's look at the report itself and the statistics. I mean, the number that's thrown around now, when we're talking, mid-January 2025, is about 45,000 people who have been killed in the conflict in Gaza. And of course, as you point out in the report, never is there a distinction that's made by the Gaza Health Ministry of who's a civilian and who's a combatant. Israel talks about around somewhere in the ballpark of about 20,000 that might be 17, 18,000, whatever it might be, who are combatants that they say that they do know. But what brought you to work on this report? What was it that you saw that you said, there's just something wrong here?
Well, it's been in the back of my mind since the start of the war, right when Israel began its counterattack following 7th of October. And what really set me, my spidey senses tingling was the rate and the alleged accuracy of which figures were coming out. It just clearly wasn't possible. If you've just leveled a building, you cannot say immediately how many people have been killed in that building. It's not how a war zone works. I mean, I served in Afghanistan, and we would, if we had to drop a 500-pounder or a 1,000-pounder, we would go and do a battle damage assessment. It would take a good few hours to work out exactly, who'd actually been in there and who'd been killed. And the idea that you can turn this around on a daily basis was ludicrous. So we've been thinking about it for a long time. I had a chance conversation with a few other researchers, and so we came together. It's me, Salo Eisenberg, Mark Slochin, and Elliot Malin. We came together and we put our heads together and came up with the reports.
So what's there's a few big findings there. Walk us through, maybe if you can, some of what the big conclusions.
Yeah, well, we can talk about the inaccuracies we found. Now, bearing in mind that obviously we had very limited way of checking these lists. Hamas make them incredibly difficult to compare, so they change columns between releases, they change the order of the names as they're published, they release them as PDFs, so you have to do work to get them into even an Excel format. So first of all, they make things quite tricky, and on what we were able to find, we were able to find people who died before the war started, people who we knew for a fact had been killed by Hamas. We found men categorized as women and vice versa. We found grown men categorized as children who then later disappeared on future evolutions of the list. And this inaccuracy is really what the media focused on when they published the report. But actually, I think the really, really important findings are slightly different. I think the first one is when you look at the demographics. So Israel's been hammered for this 70% women and children piece. It's been covered numerous times. And actually, when you look at the demographics of Gaza, it's overwhelmingly fighting age males by proportion who are dying. They were about 26% of Gaza's population before the war. And of course, if Israel was killing indiscriminately, you would expect around 26% of men to be dead. But it's not. It's way higher than that, no matter which reporting mechanism you take from Gaza. And I thought that was critical, because when we have that knowledge in conjunction with what we know about Israeli targeting processes, and I've sat in Israeli Air Force targeting cells, I've seen the products they turn out before they drop an airstrike. When you take that into account, when you take the IDF's rules of engagement into account, when you take into account the operational plan for the war, the fact that men are dying, of fighting age by far and away in the greatest proportion out of age groups in Gaza, that seems to me to be a really clear indication that Israel's targeting combatants and not just killing indiscriminately.
And you also talk about in the report, obviously, and I think what people need to understand is this isn't just a numbers game. This is weaponization of information that actually does something to the conflict itself. What do you mean by that?
So when you're fighting an information war, you're trying to achieve an effect. That's how we talk about it in military terms. You're trying to have some sort of change through participating in this campaign. And the change Hamas is trying to achieve, and have very successfully achieved, I think, is to turn world opinion against Israel and to enable the lawfare that they've undertaken in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Everything in that narrative is underpinned by these casualty numbers and by the numbers of children and women that have died. And it's curious because no other war really has this running total breakdown in the way that the Gaza war does. Nobody in Lebanon can tell you exactly how many men, women and children have died. Nobody in the wars against ISIS could tell you how many men, women and children have died. Nobody in Ukraine can really tell you how many civilians have been killed. And And so the weaponization of this narrative has enabled Hamas to achieve its strategic aims of discrediting the state of Israel and taking them to court in various international institutions.
I'm curious, you mentioned some of the misreporting, but I'm quoting from the report here. You mentioned errors of a 22-year-old registered as a 4-year-old, a 31-year-old registered as a 1-year-old, several men with male first names who were registered as females to increase the number, as you mentioned before, this attempt to try to show that the majority of the casualties are women and children, people who also died from before the war, and people who died by Hamas attacks as opposed to by Israeli missile strikes or Israeli attacks. I mean, this is. I'm just trying to understand how you guys got this information, how you're able to verify this, right? Because if you were able to, then a news outlet should have been able to do that too, presumably, right? You're not getting fed intelligence information by the IDF or the Israeli Shin Bet, right? You're just using open source information.
Yeah, quite the opposite, actually. They were remarkably intransigent whenever I asked them for information. So the bit I really wanted from the IDF was to tell me how they came to the total of 17,000 combatants dead. And it was like getting blood from a stone. The only stuff I'd managed to get from Israel was from a leak, which I'm keeping anonymous for very obvious reasons. Somebody checked something against the Palestinian population registry for me, but that's the only thing I got from the Israelis. And yeah, everything we found was open source, which probably means there's tons of stuff that we didn't find because it's just not out there. Because one of the things we did identify was that Hamas actively suppresses combatant deaths and encourages Gaza's population to do the same. And actually, I'd challenge you to think, how many times have you actually seen any footage come out of Gaza from the so-called independent journalists that are on the ground that feature dead combatants or feature dead Hamas fighters or even Hamas fighters fighting? The only places you can find that is on the Al-Quds and Al-Qassam Brigade's Telegram site. Should you be in a country where that's not banned, fortunately I am. Or you get footage from the IDF, but actually from the so-called neutral parties on the ground in Gaza, you never see this stuff.
Right.
And the fact that they conceal this stuff is a matter of record. It's easily found out. We've been on Facebook pages to see where Hamas have said from their government accounts not to talk about dead fighters, and yet the world's media has just given them an absolute free pass on this, and it's astonishing.
You also talk about 5,000 natural deaths that on average take place in Gaza annually. Those are also apparently just rolled up or folded into the overall casualty number. So really, even when they talk about the so-called 45, which is also something that we don't really know how verified and real that is, we should remove, was your point, remove 5,000 from that?
No, we can't conclusively say that all 5,000 are on there. That's not something we can prove. But we have found some cancer patients on there who we know were scheduled to leave the Gaza Strip. They may not have done. They may have just been killed before they could possibly leave. That's a possibility. But look, there's no mechanism of death on these lists. There's no identification of fighter or civilian. There's no. Not only is there no mechanism of death, there's no saying who killed them. We know how many rockets have dropped short from Gaza, fired at Israel, landed in the Gaza Strip. We
Palestinian rockets, like Hamas rockets, like what happened at the hospital in the beginning of the war, for example.
Yeah, exactly that. And we know these names are ticking over on these lists because they release these running counts. And I think what this all points to is actually it doesn't matter if it's deliberate. It doesn't matter if it's accidental mistakes, because recording deaths in a war zone is difficult. But what we do know is that they're not reliable. And so when you parrot the breakdown of men, women, and children, you can't possibly be being accurate, because not even the three mechanisms that they have for reporting deaths in Gaza agree with each other on these breakdowns. So it's just deeply irresponsible of the world's media to report these as facts. And we looked into the data, and 20% of the world's media uses these numbers without attribution or saying that they're not verified. It's right. Astonishing.
And only a small percentage are actually quoting alongside the Palestinian numbers, or saying, what the IDF numbers are with that. I mean, it's hard for me, I guess, as a Jewish Israeli, to look at this and say there's not an element of anti-Semitism here. I mean, you spoke before about someone's called a doctor, that gives them some sort of authority, but this is so absurd, right? And I've gotten into arguments with CNN and BBC anchors on live TV when they would quote, the number of people, and I would say, well, that's according to Hamas, and they would be like, what are you talking about? This is the number. And it would get into this back and forth. But I don't want to accuse those people of being anti-Semites, but there's something here that's beyond the norm of what should be acceptable.
Agreed. And I'm wary of saying everything is anti-Semitism. There's undoubtedly anti-Semitic aspects to this, without a shadow of a doubt. I did Egyptian television the other week, and I certainly won't be doing it again. But that was, they were platforming naked anti-Semites. There was a guy called David Miller who lost his job over anti-Semitism. He was platformed on there as if he was some sort of credible commentator. So parts of the world, anti-Semitism is clearly rife. I think in the West, I think it's more that they've been very cleverly played. And I'd recommend anyone to go to the Jewish Chronicle website and look up Dr. Orly Peters' article on how this empathy has been weaponized against the West by actors who know what they're doing. And I think one thing to notice, Hamas's operations have been incredibly psychologically clever. If they don't have a psychologist on the books helping them with this stuff, I would be astonished, because even down to looking at the hostage videos, if you think of Hirsch Goldberg Polin and those videos that came out, the way they were made, the production values behind them, and the way they were designed to have an impact on Israeli society. I mean, I was in Tel Aviv when those came out, and it was almost visible to see the impact of these videos on people. Like, they're very, very clever, and they have played the Western media absolutely superbly from an objective point of view.
So you served, Andrew, in the British Army from 2005 to 2021. You did 3 tours in Afghanistan, and you were attached at one point to the U.S. Army Special Forces, and you were also in a parachute regiment, Special Forces support group. You did tours in Bosnia, the Middle East, Northern Ireland. I could go on and on and on. And you're a major, of course, with the rank. But I'm curious, when you look at what's known as the combatant-civilian ratio, or civilian combatant death ratio, Israel has tried to make an argument that the ratio is somewhere 1-to-1, somewhere 1-to-1.5, let's say, right? But nowhere higher than that. And when you look at the global numbers of conflict, you are seeing, especially in urban warfare, which is what was being fought in Gaza, and you could even say it's not urban because it's above ground, it's below ground, it's in so many different tight spaces, that the average there is much, much higher, 1-to-6, 1-to-even 9 in some places. I mean, so someone who has battle experience and combat experience. You've also been to Gaza. You visited the Gaza Strip, I think, with the IDF twice over the last year or so. So just walk us through, from your lenses and what you've seen, how do you understand this war?
So I think it starts with 7th of October in the sense that you have to really go back to that date to work out why this war had to happen in the way it has. And I think that has been hugely lost in the narrative in the West. I think most people don't understand how appalling 7th of October was, and the horrendous details of what happened. And I'm in a deeply unfortunate position to have seen far more of that evidence than probably most Israelis have. I've had some pretty gory access, and it's the most horrifying thing I've ever seen in my life, and it's not even close, and that compares to any of my operational tours. Like, the levels of barbarity and horror that were visited on Israeli civilians that day, it defies belief, to the point where it's almost challenging to talk about, and the hairs on my arms start standing up. So we have to start with that point and understand just how awful 7th of October was. And I think when we frame it around that, the response that the IDF have undertaken is absolutely appropriate and proportionate. But you can point to, yes, only 1,200 Israelis died versus all these 45,000 Gazan civilians, but that's not how proportionality in warfare works. It's done on a strike-by-strike basis. So when we look at ratios, particularly of those Gazan civilians versus combatant rates, actually what is important isn't the ratio at all. It's how those civilians died. It's how the 1.4 died, not how the 1 died. Was it legal? Was it proportionate? And is the IDF operating in a way that is in line with the law of armed conflict? And I've had access to the IDF at pretty much every level, from the Kiryat downwards, even down to 2 meetings with Yoav Gallant whilst he was still defence minister, right down to meeting, your standard soldiers on the ground in Gaza. And I've never seen at any point anything that suggests to me they're not operating in the same way that the British or American armies were. If a similar attack took place on our countries, I think we would respond almost identically. And then you have to factor in the combat environment, where Hamas have deliberately weaponized the civilian population to be human shields and maximize civilian casualties. And again, this is part of the narrative that is also overlooked in the West. Hamas are completely absent from the narrative. If you read these newspaper articles, you would think that Israel was literally just dropping bombs randomly and they weren't targeting anyone, or, they were just lobbing munitions into Gaza in the hope of killing people. And there's no concept that Israel has lost hundreds of soldiers and thousands wounded. There's no concept that Israel has had to mobilize huge tranches of their society to try and make this ground operation happen. And actually, why on earth would you put ground troops into Gaza if you were just trying to kill people? Israel has the facility, if they wanted to level that place and kill everyone. It just makes no sense for you to put hundreds of your young men and women into hospital just to score easy points on Gazan civilians. It just doesn't make any sense. And so, when we look at the narrative of this war in the round, to me, with a soldier's eye, it looks reasonable. And I've been to Gaza with groups of former veterans and former soldiers and even generals, 4-star generals. And I've not met one who's come away from these trips and seen it firsthand who hasn't agreed with my position. Because once it's in context and once you understand actually what's happening and not what's mentioned in the press, then it kind of really shows you that this is just a really nasty and unpleasant war, and unfortunately civilians are always the biggest victims of war wherever that is in the world. And the fact that Israel has managed to keep it to 1 to 1.5, 1 to 1, somewhere between those numbers, it is a truly remarkable achievement. And I don't think any other army in the world would have done it in the way they have. And I think an awful lot more civilians would be dead if it were almost any other army undertaking what's happening in Gaza.
I mean, I have a lot of criticism of what happened, obviously running up, as many people do, to October 7th and the policy of containment that we had and, allowing Qatari money, for example, into Gaza to Hamas and all these different things. But all of it, I think, touches upon what you just mentioned, which is we didn't want war. And because war is so terrible for us, but also terrible for the other side, and the loss of life. So we tried so many different things, and a lot of it wrong that had been done differently maybe would have prevented October 7th. But it was all done from a point, at least, I think, the motivation of let's avoid war because it is so horrific. But what is it, Andrew, that the world doesn't understand? Because, okay, I mean, I don't want to keep on going back to the anti-Semitism because that's just not, we're never going to get anywhere from there. But is it a failure to understand how horrific war is? Is it a failure to understand exactly, because you said, you got to go, some people, I don't know about you, but some people have to go into Gaza to actually see firsthand what it is. 99% of the world more is not going to be able to go into Gaza with the IDF to see firsthand what's happening. So what is it that maybe can be done differently to tell this story?
Yeah, I mean, all the stuff you spoke about there, we all say that General Hindsight is the most successful general of all time. He's never lost a battle. But there's a variety of factors. First of all, there's decades of excellent Palestinian information operations to present themselves as these eternal victims being endlessly beaten up by the awful Jews. That's a narrative that is dominant when it comes to talking about Israel-Palestine. So anything Hamas has done has been pushing it an open door based on that narrative. The next thing is, I think, a failure to really show the world 7th of October. I think, there's arguments for and against showing that 47-minute video and then all the other stuff that you can see on top of that if you're, as I said, unfortunate enough to get access to it. I understand why they haven't, but I do think it means that 7th of October has been lost in the discourse around this. I think there is also an argument for and against journalists being allowed to see what's happening with the IDF, and I think there are ways they could have done that could have been a bit more clever than just allowing free access. They could have had more people embedded with IDF forward troops to see how they're operating. They could have shown journalists what they've shown me, and I don't quite understand why I've had the access and journalists haven't. Like, if you walk through the targeting process, then all of a sudden things do become a lot more clear. When you actually read the rules of engagement and speak to soldiers that are applying those rules of engagement, it all becomes more clear. And when you see the chaos of what combat is actually like as well, I think that would have helped the world understand a bit better, because I think a lot of people are seeing images coming out of Gaza and they don't have the understanding, the context, the ability to really analyze what they're seeing. And actually, if you've got no military experience and no real knowledge of the Middle East and the background, the decades of background to this conflict, if someone shows you a photo of a badly mutilated child's body, you're going to have a very obvious reaction, and it's going to be one of horror, and you're going to blame the people that are responsible in that, as you've been told, are responsible for that child dying. And the fact that Israel, I think this is my final point on this, the fact that Israel hasn't really fought that information war has been an own goal.
Yeah.
And that's made life a lot harder for people trying to make Israel's case on the world stage.
The war now is entering its 16th month in Gaza. Ceasefire in Lebanon, as we're speaking, still holding. Hopefully it will continue. But there's yet to be what appears to be an exit strategy out of the Gaza Strip for Israel. I mean, as someone with extensive combat experience in urban settings and the understanding, when you look at Afghanistan as an example, what was it, just a couple hours, maybe a couple of days till the Taliban took all of control over Afghanistan after the U.S. withdrawal that summer. I mean, Hamas is still there, right? They're obviously significantly eviscerated and degraded and weakened and beaten as a military organization, but they're able to recruit some of the youth, and there's still weapons out there. What is Israel's mistake, if you see one now in this kind of after war or after the high intensity stage of this conflict planning?
I mean, Israel's got two choices now. You either stop or you occupy fully, and there's no real middle ground, I think, on this one. And I tend to lean towards Mr. Gallant's position that they probably should have ended the war already, quite frankly. And I've written articles about that on my Substack, and I haven't seen anything to change my mind. If we look at how insurgencies work, Hamas were not an insurgency until very recently. They were a formed military force. They had brigades, battalions, armies. They, on the break into Gaza City, they found on defensive positions, actual defensive plans of how these fighters were going to have command and control and how much ammunition they had on each site. Now they are broken down. The fact that Hamas have been able to leverage the humanitarian aid that's going in. I think a big mistake was perhaps not taking control of the distribution of aid, because that has essentially given Hamas free resupply and a lever of control over the civilian population. But if we look at where we are now, Israel had a bunch of goals when they went into Gaza. It was to dismantle Hamas, it was to secure Israel's borders, and it was to recover the hostages. And arguably the first two of those are now achieved already. And after 16, 15 months, if your military operations haven't recovered the hostages, they're probably not going to, and there needs to be another way found to get those people home. The alternative, of course, as I said, is occupation, where you actually take over whole areas of Gaza, you run everything, and you eventually run sort of deprogramming program where you persuade Gazan civilians that you've just bombed for 15 months that actually you can be friends in future. And you expose yourself to IEDs and the kind of attacks that the British Army and the American Army faced in Afghanistan and Iraq, with very little success, if we're brutally honest. Right. And I'm very sceptical of that second option. I think it's very expensive and very lengthy and not a great idea for the reasons I've articulated. So I'm with Yoav Gallant. I think the war probably should have finished already, because actually they've achieved what they wanted to achieve. And whilst killing random Hamas goons might be, a good thing broadly, it doesn't actually take Israel any closer to achieving what they wanted to achieve when they set out.
And I think, this probably better than many, is it's easy to go into war, although you don't want to. It's very hard to extricate yourself from that war. And you need a plan in place or a process to be able to pull yourself out. And that's something that I think Israel, sadly, when I think of all the conflicts that I've covered over the last 25 years as a journalist, it's always the same problem, is this a bit, that exit strategy that is so elusive all the time.
Yeah, and it's tricky. And I think you have to just go along with the idea of, here's my strategy, here's what I wanted to achieve, have I achieved it, and have a checklist as to when it's complete. And I think the dismantling of Hamas is the tricky one, because, as I said, they're able to retain civilian control. The governance of Gaza is going nowhere. And Hamas will consider that this war has broadly been a success for them. Actually, I suspect on a geopolitical front, they've hugely damaged Israel on the world stage. They've had massive growth in support in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and their influence in Syria and in Lebanon has been untouched, if not growing. So, while that is all happening, Hamas will think actually things are going fairly swimmingly, and of course their leaders are sat, elsewhere, and they're not really being affected by any of the misery or suffering that they're quite happy to be allowed to be inflicted on Gaza's civilians.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. It was really a fascinating conversation, and really thank you for this report, Questionable Counting, Analyzing the Death Toll from the Hamas-run Ministry of Health in Gaza, which came up by the Henry Jackson Society, where you are a senior fellow. So thank you for putting this together, and thank you for being with us. Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. As always, you can find us where podcasts can be found, Spotify, Apple, and of course on YouTube and the What Times of Israel